introductory words. Welcome everybody to this fourth in the Cambridgeshire Historic Churches Trust series of online lectures. I'm David Staziker. I'm one of the trustees with a particular brief to help with events, tours, conferences, online events of this sort. As you may have gathered, this evening's proceedings are being recorded and they will be available subsequently on the Trust's website, which is quite a short URL. It's just camhct.uk to get into our website. Now, for the benefit of people who aren't members of Cambridgeshire Historic Churches Trust, our main purpose in life is to give loans and grants towards the cost of repairs and improvements like kitchens and lavatories and so on, to do these things for churches in the county of Cambridgeshire, of which we've got well over 300 altogether. Many of them, of course, are in rural villages and are looked after by congregations of often just a handful of people who meet the cost of looking after the building as well as paying for their clergy, of course. So if you're not a member of the Trust, we'd be delighted if you would join. Anyway, you can donate, if, as I'm sure you will, you enjoy this evening's proceedings. And both of those things you can do, again, on our website. Normally, we operate live conferences and tours of local churches. We've been doing that online this year, of course. And the benefit of that is that we do reach a new audience, people who wouldn't be able to come to events that we hold within Cambridgeshire. Now, this series of lectures about churches, towers and spires and the things that are normally found in and on them, those features are amongst the most prominent features of our churches, visibly and sometimes audibly. So they are, I think, the features that many people associate beyond those in the worshipping congregation, people associate with our churches. Before I introduce our speaker, just one or two technical details. Please, could you make sure that you are muted before the lecture begins? That's for most of us, I think that the control for that is in the top right of the screen, but with some it varies. It looks as if everybody has now, from what I can see. Splendid. Thank you very much. Now, if you've got any questions for our speaker, could you please use chat? So if you click on the chat button, you can then type in whatever your question is, and I think for most people that will be at the bottom of the right hand side of the screen. It could be different with some, but I think that's where it is normally. And then on most machines you have to click return in order to register that, and then that can be seen by everybody, and you can do that at any time during the talk. So you don't have to wait till the end. You can do that as questions occur to you in the course of what our speaker is saying. So our speaker tonight, Chris McKay, we're very privileged to have him. He's a horologist. He's an author of books on clock care, repair and maintenance, and he is clocks consultant to Salisbury Diocesan Advisory Committee. And he has a passion for the preservation of mechanical church clocks. So he will explain all about these clocks, their history, the different types, the history of their development. He'll talk about their care and conservation, and he will talk about some notable examples that we find here in the county of Cambridgeshire. So, Chris, over to you. We look forward to hearing from you.
Right, if you'd like to let me share my screen, I will then...
That should be possible.
Get going. Right, I'll try now. Here we go. Share screen. This will stop others seeing. Do you want to continue? Yes, please. Okay, so I'm going to share this screen, share that, and you should come up with a rather pastoral place with trees on, yes?
Yes.
Right, well, we've got that. So I'll now go into this one, and I shall do start presentation.
Excellent, Will. There, I will now mute myself.
Right, I will thank you all very much. So this is my starting strap line, which is turret clocks, preserving old historic mechanisms. It's gone. What's it doing? Old historic mechanisms for today and tomorrow, and today's heritage and for the future. Let me just get these pictures out of the way. Right. So this is the plan. We're going to do. Sorry, I'm reading ahead of myself. Well, that's just what it's about, church clock. So let's get on with it. The plan is to do a virtual visit to a church tower, some turret clock history, care and conservation, and we'll end up by looking at a handful of clocks in the Cambridgeshire area. I was there quite some years ago, so hopefully they're all still there, but they might have been restored or altered since then. So here we go. The virtual visit is going to be St. Peter's Church in Chertsey. The reason for this is I got a very good friend there who is the tower captain and tower keeper, and here's the church. Interesting history that the church contracted with a builder to build the church about the 1830s. And when the roof was completed, he would be paid. So he put up a load of pillars and columns. He built a roof. He said, pay me. And they said, no, it's not finished. He said, look, contract. When the roof's finished, you pay me. Oh, all right, they said. And guess what? He wasn't seen ever again. The tower there is stone, and then it's brick. It was being heightened when the turret clock was put in 1892. And these dials are, guess what? They're 6 foot diameter. I have gilded all of these. I have worked on the clock, done extensive work on it, and would love one day to finish off by doing some work on the carillon. So here's the clock mechanism, or the movement as we techies like to call it. It's by Smiths of Derby, a well-known company, 1892, and it's a very typical Victorian, late Victorian flatbed turret clock. We call it a flatbed because it's built on a flatbed here. So 3 trains. There's the going bit in the middle that drives the dial. This strikes the hour, and this strikes the quarters. It does Westminster quarters. So here we are in the middle. We've got the we call the going train, a weight line on a barrel, and this is the escapement here. It's called a gravity escapement, and this clock will turn in performances of seconds a week, irrespective of the weather. If we go to the right, we've got the hour striking train here, and what we've got is another barrel. You can't really quite see it, but there on the barrel there are some lobes or cams which stick out, and these raise a lever and let it drop, and that then sounds the hour. This gear here is part of the going train, and this rod here drives up to the dials. The fly at the back controls the speed of striking. Without that, the clock would run away and suffer some rather terrible damage. This is the quarter train, and you can see here there's this big barrel here with cams on it that lift, or lifting pins, and this lifts these levers here and pulls the wires down, and the wires then sound the bells. Once again, cable drum, and again another fly. Now this clock is still weight driven, so here's my good friend Malcolm winding it. and you put the handle on and you keep turning, and probably 3/4 of an hour later, you're a fitter person than when you started. Here's the pendulum. It's a special pendulum. It's called a compensation pendulum, and it stays the same length for changes in temperature. This cast iron bob probably weighs about 250 pounds. And inside here, there are concentric tubes of zinc and iron. How do you get it to time? Well, you wind the bob up or down with a screw. And here's the screw, which is a rather elegant piece of wrought ironwork. If the suspension spring ever breaks, you've only got a half an inch or something for the bob to fall. So there's not too much damage there. How's it driven? It's driven by weights. There are 3 weights. This is for the going train, striking train, and the quarter train. Now, each of these weights you can take off, and they're called cheeses. And each of those weighs 50 pounds. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 150 pounds, plus a half a weight, plus a half a weight. So you've got 200 pounds on there. You've got rather more on the striking, and I've never quite managed to count up the number on the striking train, but it really is a significant number. Up to the bells now. Here's my friend Malcolm amongst the bells. They have 8 bells there, and some years ago they had them all rehung with new headstocks. This meant that the bell hammers all ended up in slightly different positions, which was a little bit of a pain. So what I was engaged to do was to redo all the hammers. And that took 3 complete days of work, where you have to unscrew a hammer and its fittings. You move it up a bit or down a bit or left or right, and you pack it up. And it was a stinking hot day. But the lovely thing was I heard it strike the hour at 5 o'clock one evening and the carillon go off. We'll see the carillon a little bit later on. Now, here's some clock hammer bells, clock bell hammers. These 2 are for the quarter train. And in fact, on the last quarter of Westminster, 1 note strikes repeatedly. And this means the clock's got to work very hard if you just had 1 hammer. Dee da da dum da 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 dum da 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 dum dum da da dum. So the way they get round it mostly on a big clock is they have 2 hammers. There it is. The 3rd hammer here is for the carillon. The carillon here plays little tunes. We'll see a picture in a minute or so. Now, the drive rod that I showed you earlier comes up, and it inside this box here, there are some bevel gears, very much like this. So this drives out, it goes 1 dial that way, 1 dial that way, 1 dial that way, and the 4th dial goes out there. Normally, they've got a wooden cover over it, so you don't have dust getting in, but this is taken off to so people can see in my photos what it's all about. Now, behind each dial is what we call the motion work. And the motion work is the 12-to-1 gearing to drive the hour hand. So this rod comes in, it turns around once an hour. This big weight here is a counterbalance for the minute hand. Without that, the clock would stop at 9:15, or at 3:15, it would go racing ahead. This is the reduction gear, and just hiding behind there is the counterweight for the hour hand. One of the nice things about visiting towers, apart from all the people you meet, who in general are extremely pleasant and agreeable and interesting, is seeing the churches and often having a good view from the tower. Now, I'm not a person that likes heights, but I did rather like this view here, which was, I think, January. So there's this dusting of snow on the roofs of Chertsey, these Georgian houses here. Coming down, the room below the clock, there's this beastie here. It's just like a giant, great big musical box. And as this barrel turns, the pins here, they raise these levers which operate the hammers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So there's 8 bells. So one bell, one hammer for each bell, plus some spare ones. So when notes are repeated, you're able to get them. Now, there are actually 4 tunes here, and the way you get them, one turn of the barrel is 1 tune, and the whole of this mechanism here is pumped along. You can't really see it very well, there's a cam there. And I reset this one day when I was working on the clock, and at the crack of dawn, 8 o'clock in the morning, on the Sunday morning, it struck the hour, played the Westminster Quarters, and came up with a tune. Now the day is over. So clever clogs McKay failed there. Now, one of the things you often see in a church are these boxes here. We call them weight chutes, and they're just wooden casings, and the weights descend down inside there. If you're unlucky, people will put the hoover inside there, brooms, brushes, and all sorts of things. And when they finally forget to wind the clock, then it rather gets squashed when the weight gets to the bottom. Or in one case I heard of, when the weight came down, it stripped off all the electrical control gear, causing a lot of sparks. This weight here is for the carillon, and it's not hand wound anymore, it's driven by an electric motor. And these weights are rather more than, they're probably more like 75 pounds, 153. So there's 350, 400 pounds there, which is really quite a lump. And something like a carillon usually involves winding probably twice a week, or sometimes even once a day. Well, there we are, we're finished at Chertsey. I hope you've got an idea of what it was all about. Year 2000, we had the dials off. Well, I didn't do that, the builders did. And they had them epoxy painted, sandblasted, epoxy painted, and I did the gilding. And believe me, moving that cast iron dial on your own is quite a challenge, but you can do it if you're careful, is the important thing, and don't rush. Right, so we see a little bit of what's inside a church tower, and now we're going to have a flash through turret clock history. So, this is just the sort of periods I'm going to go through, a bit arbitrary, but there we are. Salisbury Cathedral, it's claimed to be 1386. It's not proven. Excuse me, to use the old Scottish jury's verdict. Certainly there was a clock there in 1386, because there is a deed mentioning the clock. But to date, no evidence has come up for any other date. So what we have here at the top is what we call a folio, a weighted arm, and that ticks forward and backwards, making about 3/4 of a turn. And it's driven by this wheel here, verge wheel, crown wheel, and verge. This takes 4 seconds to go 1 tick. It needs to be wound once a day. This is the going train, and this is the striking train, which sounds a bell. Today, it's what they call the bishop's bell. And why is a clock like this big? I think the reason the clock is big like that, because it has to strike on a big bell. And I think, looking into the history, the sort of bell up the tower in Salisbury, it had a detached campanile, was probably about a ton, and that's probably the right size for that. Well, before 1660, clocks were built like this, end-to-end frame. So the trains of gears are planted end-to-end, and the frame is invariably made of wrought iron, sometimes wood. And in 1660, the pendulum hits England. And it was one of those, a bit like the internet or the railways. It just took off wonderfully. And virtually every church clock in the world got converted from folio to pendulum. Whether the church needed the better timekeeping is questionable, but the clockmaker certainly made money out of this. So we see here, this is an escape wheel, an anchor escapement, And hanging down here is a pendulum. It's got a big hole in it, so it can tick-tock each side of the barrel there. Before long, they started revising the layout of clocks, and this clock is quite an early one, 1673, and the trains you see are planted side by side. The frame is wrought iron, the wheels are wrought iron, which hopefully you can see from the rusty state of them. And up the back here, we have a single hour hand. Where clocks did have dials, and they didn't always, almost invariably the early clocks would have just a single hand, an hour hand. And it didn't really matter too much if you were 5 minutes early or 5 minutes late. This is a place called Wadden in Oxfordshire. And as the time rolls on, people get more sophisticated. And this beautiful clock here is made by Davis of Windsor, and it's dated 1736. This was a complete heap of rust when I first got it. This is in the museum collection of Dorset clocks in Owermoyne near Dorchester. And it's got two trains, beautiful brass wheels. And this wheel here we call a count wheel. And you see there's notches on the outside. And depending upon how far this turns, this sets the number of blows. So it goes, where does it start? It starts about here, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., all the way around to 12. My hometown, well, I live just 4 miles north of Wimborne-Minster. This clock, 1742 by William Monk. William Monk worked in a village called Berwick St John, which is very much in the middle of nowhere. It's between Shaftesbury and Salisbury. And it's a classic case where a village clockmaker was very skilled. He made turret clocks, he made domestic clocks, and he was able to supply these to travelling distance of his home. So if his horse could make 20 miles in a day, that's about as far as he would go. Now this clock has been converted to have electrical winding on it, which are these units here. Very cleverly fitted in, but aesthetically, well, could do better. This clock cost, let me get this right, I think it was 42 guineas. And it was paid in 2 installations. Well, about the 1760s, 70s, 80s, a new material becomes easily available, and it's called cast iron. And this is a clock made by Hindley of York. Now, Hindley was an exceptionally good maker, and this frame is all very crisp, and it just screams to me as being cast iron. You can tell quite easily if it's cast iron. If you drill a hole in it, the swarf that comes out is black dust. If it's wrought iron and you drill a hole in, it comes out as long, twisty, sharp, horrible shavings. If you're busy drilling holes in a church clock, don't let the vicar see you. 1802, a cast iron 4-poster, we call it. It's got 4 posts. This is a clock made by Thwaites. Thwaites were established in the 1760s, and they are still around as a trading name. And this is a classic clock of theirs. And they adopted this design and they kept it till about 1860, which is quite amazing. If it works, don't reinvent it. 1826, a design called the plate and spacer emerges, where you've got a front plate, a back plate, and then spacers between them. This is in the village of Alkborough in North Lincolnshire. Alkborough is the sort of place that you go to, you never go through it. It's a interesting clock, and it's probably survived because it was in an isolated place. And in fact, it's the first gravity escapement on a turret clock, which is the bit up here, in the country. And it was made by a guy called James Harrison of Hull, who was the great-grandson of James Harrison, who was the brother of John Harrison of the famous longitude fame. 1844, Manchester, Roberts of Manchester. Now, Roberts was a machinery maker. And if you look at this clock here, this frame, you could imagine in there could be a spinning frame, water pump, steam engine. But in this case, he's decided to put a turret clock in. So cast iron is very, very useful, because if you've got one set of shapes, you can quickly duplicate it. Adding a date and a name is easy. And likewise, cast iron wheels mean it's easy to make things. And easy to make means lower prices. Well, along comes 1852. The Houses of Parliament had burnt down. They were rebuilt to Barry's design. And in 1852, a man called Edward John Dent got the contract to make a new clock, and it was installed in 1859, mostly because it took quite a long time to sort things out. Now, here is the clock itself. That's something like 16 feet long there. This is the quarter striking barrel, weighs over a ton. The flies, instead of at the back of the clock, are up here above the clock. And it's quite a noisy thing when it goes off, because it sounds like a machine gun, because there's a ratchet on here. And when it locks, the flywheel's on. And these are the drives off to the dial. And you can just see the back of a dial peeping through these windows here. If you're interested, go and buy my book about Big Ben, published by Oxford University Press, 2010. Grossly overpriced by OUP, but since writing it, very little new information has appeared. So here we are behind the dial. So apart from the flatbed construction, the gravity escapement, and a compensation pendulum, Big Ben popularized an illuminated dial. There's 312 bits in here, all of opal glass, and they've all been replaced now, and the whole dial's been scraped back. They found the original colors, which is Prussian blue, and the dials, I think at the moment they're taking the scaffolding down on one of the dials at the moment. Well, why Big Ben? It's technically it's the great clock at the Palace of Westminster. This is the great bell at the Palace of Westminster, but it got the nickname Big Ben quite early on after it had been cast, and that stuck to it, and then that stuck to the tower. So everyone talks of Big Ben, meaning the clock tower. Technically, it's now the Elizabeth Tower, but yeah, few people would understand that, but everyone understands Big Ben. This is a suspension spring. This is the pendulum hanging down. These are the pallets. This is the gravity escapement, and it has a special fly which controls the speed of the operation. No time to go into that. If you're really interested, come to my lecture tomorrow night to the Antiquarian Horological Society's Turret Clock Group. Now, this spawned out a whole load of clocks, roughly speaking, flatbeds. Gillett and Bland, 1870, flatbed, a variety of gravity escapement. This is a clock by a well-known company called Benson, James W. Benson. I'm sure Benson never made these, but we've never actually found out who actually did make them. Clockmaking was a very sort of laissez-faire business, that I could go to Benson, I could buy a clock from him, and for an extra 10 shillings and sixpence, I'd have my name engraved on the dial, making it look as though I were the maker of the clock. So don't always trust the name on a clock. This is the 3-train clock. This one here, very simple clock, made by Smith of Clerkenwell, which was a different company. This is in a church in Christchurch, now a Pentecostal church, and what used to be the old, I think, Congregational and then the United Reformed Church. I'm just thinking, okay, dials. Dials, let's have a look. Notice I said dials, I didn't say faces. Anyone who tells me about their clock face, I say, no, it's a dial. Right, Wells Cathedral, it's medieval, it's astronomical, and it's got a lot of similarities to the dial down the road in Wimborne Minster. Here's a single-handed dial with an original date on it. This is now inside the church and has been replaced since it was getting a bit crispy. Sprotborough up in Yorkshire, that is. Coombe in Oxfordshire. 1948 was probably when it was repainted. Notice here we've got a 1V, where invariably you've got 1111 on most dials. And that is usually said to balance the rather heavy 8 o'clock on the other side. Another single-handed dial. The clock is probably about 1700. This is a copper dial, convex, sorry. It's probably 50 years later than the clock itself. Interesting one here, Milton Abbey. It's about 1750, and it's made of sheet copper. You can just see one of the sheets there, which is nailed to boards, probably oak. And this rather follows an 18th century long case clock dial where you've got the numbers around the outside. Sibsey, Lincolnshire. There's a clock there about 1800. Quite fascinating. A man rang me up one day. He said, "I'm the church warden of Sibsey. Have you any idea what this copper dial might weigh?" And I said, "Hold on a minute." And I got to my computer. I found a file and I told him exactly what it weighed. He was impressed, and quite honestly, I was a bit impressed as well. But the reason is that the clockmaker who I have researched actually recorded what the weight of the dial was when he did some work on it. Again, this is copper, and you can probably see there's a joint across the middle because copper of sheets more than 4 foot wide were very difficult to get. Here we've got a dial, Blenheim Palace, probably by Vulamy. Vulamy was a very good clockmaker to the Queen. And this is in fact slate with a recess centre. And he argued that with a recess centre, the hour hand could move inside the recess, although it just about does it, which meant that the minute hand can then be very, very close to the dial, so you don't get problems with parallax. Manchester Town Hall. Manchester Town Hall is an absolute cathedral to monetary success and industry. And there's a massive clock in it. Probably could do a day's lecture on that. And once again, the dials are opal glass, they're cast iron, opal glass in, and they're illuminated from behind by gas. Bower Chalk, somewhere sort of on the way to Salisbury. I forget what the date, this is about the 1880s. And it's a very simple skeleton cast iron dial, which has been screwed to the wall of the church, and it's been gilded. And if ever you're thinking of having a church clock dial done, never use gold paint. It lasts about 3 or 4 years. Gold will last anything between 25, 50 years. Now we've got some interesting dials here. This is Whitgift in the north of Lincolnshire. It's a World War I memorial clock. It replaces, the clock in there replaces a wooden framed clock. So this originally would have had a single hand. And if anyone is watching carefully, you'll see that there is 13 o'clock at the top. The story is, or the theory is, that someone gilded the hands and the dial and accidentally put 13 on. So, oh my goodness! So they overpainted the middle one and didn't do the overpainting very well, which eventually washed off. And the tradition is now that every time the dial is re-gilded and painted, the 13 goes back at the top. Old Brampton near Chesterfield is another interesting dial. It's got 63 minutes. And you see here there's a minute short, and here there's quite a few extras. Fortunately, when this dial was repainted, and I think it was done fairly recently, the original errors were reproduced. Wells Cathedral, sometimes we have jacks, and these boys here in their suits of armour are believed to be about 1500. And on the quarters, they ting-tang on the bells, and inside there's another jack who strikes the hour. Down at Wimborne, we've got Jack, and he started off in 1613, and he was originally a monk wearing a leathern cap. And then somewhere about 1800, he gets replaced by this Grenadier Guard. Now, why in the Protestant days they'd want an animated figure on a church, I have no idea. Certainly in the Catholic days, to gather or encourage lots of pilgrims, yes. Now, we now come to the 20th century, and I did it deliberately in this way because this is the boring bit, actually, I think. 1910, Smith & Clerkenwell, mechanical turret clocks were still being made, although the numbers were significantly less because the great economic boom was over. All the town halls were built, the hospitals were built, the barracks were built, the prisons were built, and they all had their clocks to keep time. But this is 1839, Hazelbury Bryan, Thwaites and Reed, and it still works. But electricity came along, and a company called Gent of Leicester started making electrical clocks. And then, in fact, the clocks behind the dials in the Liver building are electrical. And they're a sort of a jumbo version of this. This is really just a clockmaker's electric motor. The pendulum swings, it advances a wheel, which advances the dial. And once every 30 seconds, this is synchronized with the master clock. This has the advantage of having enormous driving torque. And the 23 or 24 foot dials at the Liver building certainly need it. In the 1930s, the electric grid started to spread across the country. And here we have a synchronous clock by Gillett and Johnston. This is in Boston Stump in Lincolnshire. And we have here an electrical clock in the middle. And there's no dial, by the way. So all it does is operate some switches that operates an hour striking mechanism and a quarter striking mechanism. It's still there, but this has been updated because it's worn out once, if not twice. Rather clever system here. This is the sort of thing on the Shellmex building in London. Basically, it's a clockmaker's electric motor. It gets released every half a minute. The dials are advanced by half a minute, and the thing locks. And it all comes from a master clock somewhere down in the cellar. This is a typical modern electronic clock. We've got a little motor driving the hands here. And in here, we've got some electronics, and that can be a battery backup. It can be a receiver that picks up time signals from the Althorn transmitter or from the German one near Frankfurt, or indeed from the GPS positioning system. An example here of a ruins clock, St Albans Abbey, and here the whole of the going train has been removed and discarded, with the exception here. This is a little synchronous electric motor that drives the clock here, and all the wheelwork's been taken out of the striking train and a electric motor has been put in. So ruination. Unfortunately, a lot of this happened between 1960 and was going on even into the 21st century. One thing you can do with a turret clock is install an automatic winder to it. To get somebody to go up there once a day, which was necessary for some clocks, is quite a chore. So the automatic winder gets rid of that. What do we have? We have an automatic winder, we have a gearbox, we have a drum with a wire on it that goes down, and there's a weight on the end, and that then drives the clock. So that we have a small weight, which is rewound, let's say, every hour, and it gets rid of the need for those enormous weights that we first saw when we had the little trip round Chertsey Church. Christchurch Priory, a clock I used to look after. The auto winders, 1966, early days, and they got rid of the wooden barrels, and at some stage the bell ringers sawed off the winding squares because they got in the way of the bell ropes. Nobody's admitted to doing that. What about care and conservation? Well, this is Our Lady of English Martyrs in Cambridge. And we've got a synchronous motor time switch. We've got something here that counts the number of blows for the hour, something here for the quarters. The wheelwork's been removed. There's an electric motor under there. So it works, but aesthetically, it's a bit of a heap. Now, what's the solution? Now, the first thing you can do to preserve a clock is annual maintenance. Get somebody, a turret clock maker who's familiar with these things, to do an annual maintenance. Use somebody who's experienced. All it means is they give it a basic clean out, wipe off the oil, put fresh oil on in the right place. Don't smother the whole of the clock with oil because it doesn't help. And the other thing is to have a dedicated clock carer, somebody who's familiar with it, and if it needs setting to time or restarting or something like that, they have got the ability to do that. And if something does go wrong, then they can report back to a turret clockmaker what the issues are. Do remember that there is a diocesan clocks advisor, and then there's a church buildings council and clocks advisors forum code of practice, which is really aimed at the turret clock restorers as to what they can and what they can't do. But whatever you do, be conservation minded. That's conservation minded. Oh well, that's not doing badly for spelling at the moment. Now, this is the sales pitch now. I wrote this book and it developed, and then this is the latest edition, the Turret Clock Keeper's Handbook. It's aimed at somebody who looks after a clock. Tells you how to wind it, how to set it to time, how to correct the striking if it gets wrong, how to restart it. And there's quite a bit about if you're undertaking a restoration project, about what the sort of things you need to be talking about with a turret clock restorer. Available on Amazon. We'll end up now by having a walk around some Cambridgeshire church clocks. A late friend of mine, Tony Hartridge, was very aware of his clients, I think he called them, which was old churches in Cambridgeshire. And it's a bit of a random hodgepodge, this. So it doesn't represent exactly what's in Cambridgeshire. Start off with Conington, and a dial of the mid-17th, 18th century. And look at this one here. This is, could this have been an earlier dial with those little roundels? being the hour marks? Don't know. Papworth Everard. Oh, we've got a flatbed clock here. I don't know who it's by. The black and white is just, I don't have colour for everything. I've been taking pictures for a long time now. And but the reason I brought this one up was so you could see the dial. And as you see that the paint has all come off. But what you usually find is because gilding is gold, it protects the paint for a long time. So when the paint is long gone, you still get a shadow where the gilding was. And so this would come up beautifully if it was removed, painted, gilded, and reinstalled. Perhaps it's been done because this is probably 10 or 15 years old. Orwell, I don't know if our bell ringer from Orwell is still with us, but this clock I think was reputed to have come from Trinity College in Cambridge at some time. The dial is slate and relatively modern, and 2 hands. Originally, this would have had probably no hands at all, and then probably just a single hand. Swaffham Prior now, big wrought iron clock. You can see here the ropes are going up. And we've got on the right here a probably relatively modern dial. Oh, look, we've got 1V back again. 1V started life by, we believe, by Pugin, Augustus Northmore Welby Pugin, who was the architect of the clock tower at the Houses of Parliament. Barry never acknowledged him for anything, but he was a very clever person. And he used 1V on the Big Ben dials. But the figures are so Gothic and ornate, it's impossible to read them anyway, so we don't worry too much. Foxton, 1723. Wrought iron, very solid frame here. What can I say? Brass wheels now. Haslingfield. Very similar clocks, similar date. Sometimes these clocks are dated, sometimes they are not. And one thing that can happen is a clock like this can actually be a reincarnation of a much earlier clock from before the pendulum period, where they were taken apart, the trains were turned round, and the whole lot rebirthed. Swaffham Bullbeck. This is one of the cases where somebody strapped an electric motor on the arbor here, so the escape wheel just goes round at a nice speed. The pallets have been disconnected, and the same thing for the striking. Now, the advantage of that system is that if some stage the church wants to return it to a mechanical clock, they can quite easily do so. Eltersley. Eltersley is quite interesting because the clock here came out of Chertsey, and when they got their new clock in 1892, Eltersley picked up their old clock second hand. Here we've got the dial at Eltersley, but more interestingly, this wooden structure outside. Sorry about the very, very sort of misty, foggy picture. It's me. It's not the weather. I think I was shooting into the sun. And that is a wooden case which the clock weights go down. Croxton. I got an echo on the line. Are you still connected? Oh no, that's better. Croxton, this is interesting. We have a wooden frame here. Wooden frame turret clocks do exist. They appear between about the 1680s, actually before that, and they carry on up till about 1710, and they exist in a swathe from East Anglia across the Midlands to Gloucestershire. Very rarely found down south here, and sometimes found up north. Well, we're back to Our Lady of the Martyrs. I've shown you one all this ready. So this is a classic box installed by Smith of Derby in the 1970s or 80s, which just drives the thing. The advantage of this, of course, is that it's a fit and forget in the main. You don't have to think too much, and you don't have to have somebody who understands turret clocks. Now, I don't know how many of you met this one, Fulbourn. Apparently, this appeared in the Times in the last week. 1525, Richard Wright left various parcels of land to the church for the maintenance of the clock. And they've just sold one of these patches of land for £1.8 million. So the clock will get the best gold star treatment now on. We're going to end not in a church, but in Trinity College. I've been privileged to have special treatment here because my brother-in-law this used to be his office here behind the clock dial. And there is some bells on the top. Excuse me. And here is the clock. It's a flatbed by Smith of Derby. Very unusual. It has 4 trains. It's got the going train in the middle. It's got a quarter train. It's got an hour train, and it's got a second hour train. And it strikes the hour. It strikes the quarters. It strikes the hours, and then a minute or two later, it strikes the hours again, and it's called striking the hours for St John's, a neighbouring college that doesn't have a clock. This is looked after by Hugh Hunt, who's one of the, I don't think he's a professor yet, but he's a jolly clever bunny. And if you're there listening, hello, Hugh. He's added a barometric compensator, just something that's bolted on, easy to take off if you get conservation minded. And there's little weights here you can put on a tray to regulate the clock. There is a relic of an earlier clock here. This is the setting dial you find inside with a date on it, 1726. So we end up with Trinity College, and without more ado, I will close this presentation and I will unshare my screen, and we can get back to normal. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Right.
Esther Aki.
Ah, is that cricket there?
Yeah, hang on a minute. Just checking my name tag. Yes.
Sorry, this is a friend of mine I inadvertently invited along. We used to drink beer together, but now he's emigrated to Spain. So there we are. Right, shall I look at these questions, David?
Yeah, yes, that was a magnificent survey of the subject, Chris. Yes, we've got quite a few questions, I think. So,
well, I got 2 in the chat box, only 2, which is perhaps there's more. I don't know. Are clocks listed for preservation by the CBC like bells and bell frames are? Sort of not yet. Oh, there's some more coming up. How many clocks are on the CHR? Who puts them there? What's the CHR, Graham?
Hello, yes. Church Heritage Record. It's just recently that Church Heritage Record in the last year have put all the bells on their inventory, and I noticed that there are quite a few clocks, but it's very hit and miss. For instance, Ely St Mary's has got the electric version on, but Cambridge Great St Mary's doesn't have an entry. And on the sort of enthusiasm of the local.
I'm not sure as to who's entering those. Many towers don't have clocks. Is this because of lack of money or patronage? Probably both. You get usually when a church gets a clock, it carries on with a clock, and certainly if it's in an industrial rich area, usually there's a benefit in the wings waiting to die and to pay for a new clock. So sometimes you get clocks only lasting perhaps 50, 70 years before they get repaired, but some in village churches go on forever. I believe the clock Mecca Cathedral was built by George 1812. Will the cathedral have a dedicated conservation program? Don't know.
Well, I suppose I I ought to pass that one on to the chapter of Ely Cathedral, oughtn't I? I'd better make a note of that one and find out, but I don't know the answer.
I have seen the clock, and it's a lovely installation, and it's all in good nick. So that's it.
I asked the question because I live quite close to the cathedral, and certainly I think it's got two faces and one internal. They look as though they're in need of a bit of TLC, and I just wondered whether or not they would be monitoring this, or whether or not some special sort of funding ought to be sought from somewhere. To a bit concerned that it's left a great
Funding is interesting. The Church Buildings Council, CBC, does give grants for clocks. They're getting more picky now, and they're sort of saying it's only for conservation of clocks.
Yeah.
So if it was sort of a basic repair or the addition of a automatic winder, no. I think they're even sniffy now about dials, and I think dials are an important part of the clock. So you can get grants for them, but they only meet once a year. But you've got a good chance of getting a grant from them because they might only have a dozen applications in a year. So you should get something. But there's other things, obviously local people, things like landfill. There's a landfill tax, I believe, and people can, landfillers can give money away. There's obviously the Heritage Lottery Fund and so on. So if you start looking hard, there is quite a bit out there. So
Thank you.
I think I've done all the questions, haven't I?
Where are we?
I can say, unless you got some more, David.
Oh, yes. Carillons seem, yes, might spell it. Carillons seem rare. Are there any in Cambridgeshire? I don't know.
I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Thank you. Is that everything? Well, many towers don't have clocks. Is this because of lack of money or patronage?
It's a mixture, yeah. We've got Peterborough, John Joe and Peterborough. Great Gransden, right?
Yeah.
Is there Honey Still for Tea Church?
No, that's Grantchester.
Grantchester, sorry. Yep, you're right. I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I have seen Great Gransden in the past, I'm sure.
Yeah. And John says Peterborough, St Hobe. Yes, I don't know.
Yeah, it seems to come through very slowly to me, this lot. There we go.
That seems to be all the questions. So it only remains for me to thank thank you, Chris, for an absolutely splendid talk and for answering those questions. And again, a reminder: if you want to see this talk again, it has been recorded. And again, if you would like to join Cambridge Historic Churches Trust and or to give a donation to the trust, please do visit our website. So that was the fourth in this series of online lectures. Our fifth was on Tuesday, the 28th of September, and that is by our former secretary, Rob Walker, who many of the trust members will remember, who is one of the leading experts on our local churches, and he will talk about the general subject of towers and spires. So we look forward to to having many of you with us again on the 28th of September. And thank you again, Chris, for an absolutely splendid
Well,
evening.
thank
We
you
are
for
most grateful to you.
having me.
And we are grateful and very much better informed than we were. And I hope that your remarks about looking after clocks will be taken to heart by those of our members and other people watching who have some responsibility for the care of church clocks. So thanks again, and good night to everybody.
Good night, David, and good night, everyone.